Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I've got a lot of content I'm going to try to drive through, so I'm going to go as quickly as I can here, and hopefully you can all follow along. But there's really 5 key questions that I'm going to try to answer. First is, who am I? What do I mean when I say governance? Why do we need governance as a community? What are other open source communities doing? And what is the kind of a little bit of the meat of the proposal that I'm putting forward? So I've been contributing to LLVM since 2013. I've been around the developer meetings a lot. You guys have all seen me. I've made contributions that have been small, contributions that have been big all over the LLVM project in a whole bunch of different sub-projects in a whole bunch of different areas. I've been on the winning side of disagreements, and I've been on the losing side. And so I know both sides of this, and I care very deeply about LLVM, which is why I'm also on the LLVM Foundation board, as well as making my entire career being around LLVM. When I'm talking about governance, what I'm really talking about is a set of policies and procedures that have this goal of making sure that the community operates smoothly and that the long-term health of the community is prioritized. And really, it focuses on 3 key areas: decision-making, accountability, and oversight. And for the most part, this shouldn't change the way that we do things day to day. Like, I'm not proposing that we radically change the way that we operate, but making some small changes to help smooth out some of the rough edges. One really important thing to note is that I think that a lot of the systems that we've been using for years are really, really breaking down. And in particular, like, maybe they kind of worked when we could all get together at a bar in Mountain View down the street, but they don't really work as well when the community is getting bigger and bigger and more geographically dispersed. I think that's made it so that big changes are harder and harder to make every year, and that more things are falling through the cracks and just not getting solved. One of the areas is decision-making, and decision-making problems cause all sorts of problems inside of our community, like contributors burning out because they can't get their changes through, decreased support from our corporate overlords that pay us all. Like, if you have to fight with your manager to get you to open source something, that impacts our community in a negative way, and it leads to this lower threshold for companies forking LLVM, and there are so many forks of LLVM that this has fragmented our ecosystem, and in some cases it's fragmented related ecosystems because they're all based off of other forks. Accountability is also a key problem in our community, where we don't have people responsible for really crucial things like infrastructure and making sure our code owners' files are up to date, making sure that our developer policy is accurate and up to date and followed by all of the projects. All of these inconsistencies lead to barriers to getting new contributions in and make our community harder for new people to come in. We also don't really have systems for oversight. And Chris, as amazing as he is, being the benevolent dictator of LLVM isn't really a feasible option. And when the code owners do step in, they kind of lack the clear authority to do things. And sometimes when they actually do things, the backlash from the community can be enormous. And so we put these code owners out there and then we let them get slaughtered by the community because no one supports them and gives them the authority to do it. And this turns into sometimes we have governance by the loudest voice or the last person standing. And none of this is good for our community health. So I think there's a better way. And I really want to believe that we can do something better here. And so I kind of looked at what other open source communities did, and I focused on 3 specific communities. And I'm mostly picking 3 because I don't have a lot of time here, and so I'm going to be fast. But I looked at a lot of other communities too. These 3 just had things that stood out to me. And those 3 communities are Apache, Python, and Rust. Apache is kind of interesting because it's a federation of related projects. And each project gets to set a bunch of their own policies. They have a lot of independence, but they have this Apache way, is what they call it, which is a kind of loosely defined system of values that base a whole lot of what they do. And I'm not going to read through this giant wall of text, but some of these are values that I think are consistent in our community today. Things like the fact that we're all community peers. It doesn't matter if you work for a big tech company or if you're a student. We're all coming into the community at an equal footing. We also, seek consensus, and we try to be vendor neutral and not prioritize one vendor. The second to last point on this slide, though, is something that I think is an area where we as a community could actually improve, and we can take something from what Apache is doing, which is this maxim of community over code. And I think there are times in the past where LLVM has prioritized technical contributions over the health of the community, and we've always suffered for it. And so codifying this as a value for our community, I think, is really important. And so when I look at Apache versus LLVM, we're a much tighter knit group of projects, and so their model doesn't quite work for us. We need something that's more consistent. But I do think that the idea of having codified values that we actually write down for our community is something that's really important, and it gives us the ability to have a way when something isn't explicitly spelled out in a policy somewhere, we have at least a guiding principle to base how we're handling it. Looking at Python, Python is also a really interesting project, and they have a governance model that came from within their community. They have a small core team, and this leads to like a really different shape of their community because their core team of developers is very small, but they have like a huge number of users, a much larger number of users, I think, than we really have in our community. They evolved their process around this evolving decision-making process, and all of their governance came out of this decision-making process. And of course, they have elected leadership, which is something that's really interesting because it gives the community say in who their leaders are. The Python Steering Council is their leadership body, and it came in to replace Guido when he stepped down as the benevolent dictator. The structure was defined through their proposal process, and the community voted to adopt it. The Steering Council's members are elected by the core team, and I think that's a really interesting model. But there's also some things that are different for LLVM. And so like, we do have a formalized decision-making process that we don't use as much as we maybe should. And we've never had elections. And if you look at the size of their contributor base, they have about a 30-to-1 ratio of core team members to their elected positions. For LLVM, that would mean about 60 elected people. And that's actually probably not an unreasonable number, but it's something to keep in mind. And I think their structure of having one team that oversees the whole project, that's not going to work for LLVM. And so that leads me to Rust. And Rust is another interesting thing to look at because like their governance model was actually shaped by Mozilla. And they started with a core team of Mozilla engineers, and they've had a rocky history with their governance. They structured the project to have teams that had specific areas of responsibility, and then a core team that oversaw it. The core team was initially members of Mozilla, like their employees, and then it became volunteer as people moved around and things shifted. But they lacked kind of this clear, how do you become part of the core team? In 2020, issues with the core team membership and accountability became really big problems that culminated in 2021. The entire Rust moderator team resigned. This is actually a really crucial point because the big underlying problem that they had was that the community didn't have the ability to be represented by these teams. And since they didn't get a say in who was accountable and who provided the oversight, things really went sideways. They resolved it earlier this year by adopting this new leadership council model. And the new leadership council is comprised of representatives from each of the top level teams. And the leadership council doesn't actually have to be the maintainers. They're focused more on prioritizing and identifying work, distributing it to other people and other teams, and making sure that things get done in much more of an oversight capacity. I think Rust is something that we can learn a lot from, both because we can learn from their challenges, and also because like they also had this hierarchy of teams. They have accountability and oversight as key components of their system. They focused on facilitation in their governance model rather than the people who actually need to be writing the code. And of course, they have a formalized decision-making process, which is becoming more and more common through a lot of open source communities. So taking all of this and trying to define a solution for LLVM, I really wanted to define the core values of the community. I wanted to build off of the decision-making process that Chris Latner put out a couple years ago and create a system of teams responsible for different areas of the project and have an overseeing council that kind of gets everything that falls through the cracks to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. And then the last point here, too, is some of the governance models tried to define more clearly the relationship between the community government and the nonprofit foundations that support them. And I think that's a key area for us, too, is trying to really define how the community and the LVM Foundation interact. So the core values that I kind of picked to settle on is that, we are a community of peers. We give respect to everyone who comes to us, and authority in the community is kind of earned through the contributions and the work that you put into the community. And so you get as much out of LLVM as you put into it. Prioritizing public communication, especially important as we become more and more geographically dispersed. We need to take things out of the Tide House socials and move them into a public forum. And prioritizing community over code so that we always ensure the health of the community over everything else. And then lastly here is I think we need to adopt a really broad definition of what a contribution to our community is. It can't just be writing code. We have to actually embrace this wider definition of people who do code reviews, people who help with issue triage, people who are mentors, people who are involved in the community, even if it's not writing patches. And of course, all of this is governed under the Community Code of Conduct. And I think this is another point that's important to us, is that defining these governance structures is really crucial, but we have to have the code of conduct in place as well to make sure that everyone is behaving, in accordance with the way that we want our community to behave. And one of the things here too is that means that inside the governance structures, you're expected to behave, respectfully, and you're expected to put the community into a good light here. And so things like voting multiple times or using the voting structures to try and exclude members, that's not going to be okay in our governance model. When we look at decision making, I think the LLVM decision making process is really good. The one big flaw to it is that Chris is a single point of failure. And so we need to be able to actually divest some of that into these elected leader teams so that we have people who can make decisions, and it doesn't always have to be Chris. And I think we really need to embrace this process and use it more. The RFC that I'm going to be posting later today is the 4th proposal in 4 years, 5 years. So we really need to be using this process more because it's actually a pretty good process and it works, I think, really well when we try it. Another key piece here is we're going to have elections. And I really think that we need to have the ability to elect our representatives. This is going to require a bunch of changes in our community. We're going to have some system of registering voters, and we're going to have some way of measuring who gets to vote and how this works. And my proposal has a lot of details on this that I'm kind of still in flux on. But I think it's really important to come up with a way that this is quantifiable and automatable so that there isn't any question about suppressing people's votes. The area teams, as I've defined them in my proposal, they are intended to be mediators. And while they have decision-making authority, the intent isn't so much that they're the maintainers making the decisions as much as they're presented with potentially opposing viewpoints and how do you drive to a decision for the community. And the area teams will each elect a chair for the area team who represents them on the project council. And then one of the key responsibilities here is actually making the area teams responsible for the code owners' files for their area of the project. This needs to be a perpetual thing. We always have to be updating the code owner's file, and we can't just do it once every 10 years. We need it to be something that someone owns and is responsible for. And of course, this last point, I keep saying this over and over again. The people on these teams do not have to be the expert maintainers. The soft skills that April talked about in our keynote today, those are actually more important in this context than the technical skills of being the best engineer in a space. The project council is going to have a broad mandate, and that mandate is going to be to support the community, to prioritize accessibility, inclusivity, and sustainability for the project, and to maintain the relationship between the project governance and the LLVM Foundation. They will be able to take a role to help facilitate seeking consensus, and as kind of a last resort, if everything bubbles up all the way to the top, they can act as a final decision maker when necessary through the decision-making process. The LLVM Foundation, it exists to support the project, and that's a really crucial thing. And all the people on the foundation board care deeply about LLVM. But to codify a few things here, like the LLVM project, or the foundation controls project assets, like the GitHub accounts, like the web domain. They collect money to fund programs. And the management of the foundation and the board of the foundation do have a lot of decision-making authority about how money is spent. And a lot of that comes from legal protections and corporate nonsense that none of you want to be bored by. But I think it's important to understand that it is this separate and independent entity that exists to support the community. And figuring out how to manage that relationship is something that we need a governance model to actually help us with. I have a lot more details about this, and I'm going to publish later today the full text of this proposal, and I hope you all will read it. I hope you will find me in the hallways and chase me down, and we can talk about this. The proposal is written by me and a group of co-authors whose names are going to come up on here in a minute. But I think we really need this to be a starting point for a conversation. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not even saying that we need to go with my solution. But I do think we need to solve this problem. And so this is where I really put it on all of you. I am one voice in the community. I have a group of co-authors who helped me write this paper. And we care deeply about this problem. But we need your feedback. If you don't like the proposal, write your own. If you want us to change something, comment in the pull request, comment on the forum, find me in the hallway. Let's figure out a solution to this problem so that we can ensure the health of the community for years to come. And I really, really, really need to thank people, because this proposal would not have come together without a lot of support from people throughout the community. I had lots of people reviewing this proposal, lots of conversations with people. Even people outside of our normal community contributed and helped me come up with the ideas around this. And so all of this comes together from a culmination of a community working together. And hopefully we will continue working together and keep making this community great. And that is...
I want to thank Chris for that. As I say, it's a super important place for us to start. And there are 2 mics for questions, or I can walk this one around. So there should be questions.
Don't all rush the stage at once.
Yeah, well, thank you for this quite interesting talk. I haven't looked into the proposal already. But I've asked myself, have you looked into what the Cloud Native Computing Foundation does? Because they define an open governance model and provide a lot of information on how governments could be implemented on projects. So I was actually appearing Open Source Summit Europe several weeks ago, and there was a lot of talks discussing especially how governments should be set up. And I was sitting there literally and was wondering, well, yeah, in LLVM we don't have it there, and it's working totally different. And I was wondering if you also have looked into that resources beside the foundations you already mentioned in your talk.
So that's actually not something that I'd come across, and so it's not, that wasn't in my research. I did look at OpenXLA, Node. There's a really great book, and so some of these resources I actually have listed in my proposal in an appendix, but there's a really great book called Working in Public that I strongly recommend people who are interested in the subject area look it up, and it talks about some of the community issues that open source communities have had. I think that one of the things that I like about our community is that we have so many people who work on different things and in different areas that I'm hoping that through this discussion will bring more ideas in. So if you have a link or something that you can send to me, please do, because I would love to read more about it and see if there's things that we should change and adjust about the proposals to make it kind of better and improve everything. But yeah, that wasn't something that had come up in the research I did.
All right, thank you. Happy to chat.
Thanks.
Hi. You mentioned earlier on that there were some cases in the past where LLVM has prioritized code over, which has hurt the community? Do you have any examples of that?
Oh. So yes, I have examples, and I'm trying. Give me a second to think about how to say this without throwing anyone under the bus. So like, I think probably a good example is actually something close to what I work on now, which is in like 2015, the Kronos community tried to contribute SPIR-V into HLS or into LLVM, and they met a lot of resistance, and they had a really hard time getting any of their contributions in. And one of the things that happened as a result of that is, if you're not familiar, SPIR-V is a standard and portable intermediate representation for GPU programs. The precursor to SPIR-V was SPIR, which was based on LLVM 3 2-bit code. And it had all these technical flaws, but it was literally like built into LLVM. It was part of the community. It was part of Clang to support OpenCL. And SPIR-V is not built into Clang. And it supports the newer OpenCL and the Vulkan standards, but it's not built into Clang because in 2015, we could not get the community together to help get their contributions in. And something that has happened since then. So one is we have brought SPIR-V in recently, and it's great that it's come into the community, but in the absence of it being in LLVM, a whole bunch of people went and built a whole bunch of tools somewhere else that operate on SPIR-V. And so there's this whole split ecosystem where the people that work on SPIR-V do it over here, and the people who work on LLVM do it over here. And even though they're solving a lot of the same problems, we completely fragmented the community. And I think the problem here is like, we need to have a way where we can prioritize that like the long-term health of the community is better than any individual technical problem. And like really what it boiled down to was some people just didn't like some details of their technical solution. And we just let that drive a wedge. And I think there are other decisions too. Like we've had situations sometimes very publicly about contributors getting angry and running away. Or we've had contributors who have gone off and done things that the rest of the community didn't like, and then we have to go clean them up. I hope most of us have kind of been around long enough to have seen some of these things, so I don't really want to throw people under the bus, but I think it's definitely a problem that we've had. Yeah.
I thought great that you're doing this work. Great it's being done collaboratively with the existing people, because I think that's the way to move forward if you can do it. And good that you've looked to learn from other communities. I just wondered if there is one other compiler community out there of size, which is GCC. I wondered, and I'm sorry, I realize it's a bit heretical, but had you looked to see what you can learn for them? Because I suspect there are things you could pick from that and how it's a smaller community, but how a compiler community works. Yeah,
I mean, so trying to think how I think there are definitely things that we can learn from the other C compiler community. I do want to point out that 2 of the communities that I listed are compiler communities, both Python and Rust. So I did look at other compiler communities in this talk, but I think one of the reasons why I'm definitely not going to lead with things from that other unnameable compiler community is frankly because I think that our community has, for many years, had a resistance to accepting things that they do. In fact, I even got feedback on an earlier draft of my proposal that some of the names that I used were too similar to the names that they used for their structures. And so I renamed things to avoid it because I don't want people to read what I'm putting out here and hate it immediately because that other compiler community did something. So yeah, this is one of those politics things that I kind of...
I stand in both communities and I understand it, and it frustrates me immensely that we cannot get over that. But yeah, I understand where you're going with that. But I think it's worth, even if you don't say it, you actually look at some things, because there are some things I think that GCC does get right, and they may not be appropriate for LLVM because it is a smaller community, but it might be just worth having, even if you don't put it on your slides, having a look at them.
I also think one of the things that is part of why our community has survived as long as it has without solving this problem is that there's a certain chunk of the problems that we solve that you can kind of point to empirically. Like a compiler optimization either is profitable or it's not. You're either implementing a language standard or you're not. Like we don't define the language. And so I think in some of those cases, we can kind of sidestep some of the more, I guess, flexible debate topics. And I think that is very different from us versus GCC as we're expanding the community into more and more experimental areas and more areas where we don't have a right answer or a wrong answer. We can't point to a language standard or a technical specification or an ISA doc and say, this is better.
Can I just comment on the whole GCC thing? I think we can use those letters here. So I think your approach is really great, right? It doesn't matter why they use things or where they came from or any of the drama or politics or the other things you're worried about. I understand that gaining consensus within the LLVM community can be challenging, Chris, so I understand where you're coming from, but I think we should just look at, do they have good ideas?
I think that's what I'm suggesting. And,
right?
I emphasize.
And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where the ideas come from. All we care about is getting the best thing.
Exactly.
And so, if the GCC community has better ideas on anything, like we should be open to adopting them, just because we want to get the best quality result.
Yeah, I would like to. Of course, the GCC community did take your code of conduct process last year and adopt it. So, that for the call.
We do need to wrap up here and roll into the lightning talks, I think. So we might have to skip Vasil's question there or have that offline. So I'm going to introduce the lightning talks, and we're just going to go through them. Oh, right, yes. Thank you, Chris. All the questions and things.